The PlayStation 2. My white whale. This is the best-selling video game console of all time, and ironically, me being a big video game nerd, I've never actually owned one of these. I mean, until now that is, obviously. I saw this one pop up on a local online marketplace, and I figured, yeah, why not? I can buy a little piece of video game history, I can restore it, and it'll be a fun little project. And then I went down the rabbit hole and I realized there is an absolute ton of mods and other fun things you can do to these old consoles. So today, we are going to take this little piece of video game history and we are going to completely modernize it for 2023. The first thing I want to do is tear down this console so that we can install some mods in it. But I wanted to point out real quickly that this one actually already has a period correct retro mod installed in it. The keen-eyed among you may have noticed that there is this top loading hatch here. So the way this would work is you would insert a special disc to boot your PlayStation 2. That disc would then bypass the copy protection and then you could play burned games on it. So when I bought this thing, it came with a bunch of burned games as well, though by the time we're done with it, we won't be needing those anymore. When it comes to tearing down these old consoles, I can't think of a more useful tool than my electric screwdriver. Not only is it a huge time saver when you're removing dozens of screws, but it's also surprisingly cheap. So I'm going to include a link for that, along with all the other tools and materials that I use throughout this project down in the video description. Once I had the main shell off, I started removing all the stuff we're going to be replacing. The disk drive was my first casualty. It's 2023 and there are much better ways to store your games now. Next was this loud dying fan. We're going to replace that and give the whole cooling system a solid upgrade. And then the last thing was the original power supply. Not only is this big and bulky, but it also dumps a ton of heat inside the PS2. So I found a much more efficient and compact system to replace it. With all that stuff done, I removed the screws holding the steel midframe in place, flipped the motherboard over, and then carefully pried off the RF shielding that covers that delicious retro hardware. Wow, so when you look at how tiny this thing is once you strip it all away, a couple of things that I'm noticing right off the bat, this motherboard is orders of magnitude more complex than the motherboard of the Nintendo 64, and those two consoles were only released like 4 years apart, so it just goes to show the crazy pace of technological change during that era. Another thing here, we have the network expansion port. Now we're actually going to utilize this to do a massive storage upgrade to this PS2, but before we do that, I think I should give this whole board a good thorough cleaning, and then we are going to upgrade the cooling. Using isopropyl alcohol, I cleaned off the remnants of the original thermal pads and then scrubbed away 23 years of dirt and grime. I also took this opportunity to replace this long since dead clock battery so that the PS2 can keep track of time even when it's powered down. Then I cut some replacement thermal pads that are made out of a much more efficient material. They're probably about twice as thermally conductive, and that's not even taking into account the age of the original pads. Continuing right along with our theme of cooling upgrades, I grabbed a 60mm Noctua fan to replace the original. Now, there is a voltage mismatch here. The original fan runs at 7 volts and this new one runs at just 5. So that will cause the fan to overspin a little bit. This isn't the end of the world, but it did create a few issues that we'll talk more about during the post-mortem analysis at the end of the video. With the factory connector spliced onto the new fan, I was able to plug it right into the PS2's motherboard. So those are 2 easy mods that you can do that will make your PS2 run quieter, cooler, and theoretically should also extend the life of the PS2. The next thing I want to do is, well, it's also going to make it run cooler, but it's also going to make it more convenient to use the PS2. This is an REPS2. This replaces this, but I think we can go a little further. By chopping off the original barrel plug connector and then replacing it with this trigger board, we can power the PS2 with a USB-C cable. By bridging these 2 contacts, I can configure this tiny chip to request 12 volts of power from a standard USB-C power delivery adapter. Now, unfortunately, the power delivery spec is a bit of a mess. So not every adapter will supply 12 volts, but in my experience, most of the good name brand adapters will. With everything soldered together and connected back to the wall, I tested with a multimeter to make sure that I was getting the correct voltage. So the next thing I want to do is upgrade the graphics of the PS2, but this Next part is going to strain the limits of what I can do with my own body. Inside this box, I have the Retro Gem from PixelFX. And this is basically an HDMI mod. It takes the image signal coming off the PS2 and makes it available for output via HDMI, which is really handy if you want to connect the PS2 to a more modern display. So why did I say this is beyond the limit of my body? Well, the PS2's motherboard is really, really small, so I got a little bit of help. This guy is a digital microscope. There's a camera down here, a screen up here, and it provides up to 1,000 times magnification. So yeah, still not super sure myself, but wish me luck. As a warm-up, I started with the easy stuff, like bridging these contact pads on the Retro Gem, removing the optical audio port, and removing a number of components on the motherboard that were gonna be in my way. Other components, like this crystal oscillator, couldn't be removed entirely, so I relocated it a few inches to the side using some wire. All of this was in an effort to give me better access to the pins on the motherboard that are responsible for transmitting both audio and visual signals inside the PS2. Unfortunately, they were now surrounded with metaphorical landmines in the form of exposed contacts. So, as an added layer of protection, I painted on a layer of solder mask, which you can think of like an electrically insulating paint that gets cured in place with a UV flashlight. The next step was stealing those aforementioned signals and rerouting them to the Retro Gem with a specially designed ribbon cable. And if you didn't get a sense of scale before, I think my fingertips in frame here should show you just how fine this work was. Using Kapton tape, I secured the ribbon exactly where I wanted it, laid out some flux, and then proceeded to completely botch the first 3 sets of pins. The nice thing about solder though is that you can almost always fix these types of mistakes with a solder wick, some flux, and a healthy helping of patience. Eventually, I got it looking pretty decent. And thankfully, the rest of the install went a lot smoother. The flux I'm using here is key to making this kind of work possible. It cleans oxidation off your contact points and allows the solder to flow onto them much more easily. It's actually kind of magic when you get it working right. The solder just seems to know where you want it to go and slides right into position. And also, keeping the tip of your iron clean is key for managing the solder. If it gets a layer of oxidation over it, the solder won't stick to it, and it makes pushing and pulling the solder around a lot more difficult. I learned a lot doing this project, and it was only my second time ever microsoldering, so it's not some crazy skill that you need years of practice to do. And also the microscope helps a lot. That being said, I was still pretty nervous when it came time to plug everything in and take this thing for a test spin. Here we go. Come on. And hey, look at that. It works. Oh, that is fantastic. Now, let's talk about games. You know how I said earlier that we wouldn't be needing this DVD drive anymore? Well, that's because we are going to be replacing it with this, a 1 terabyte SSD. With this, we should be able to store somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 PS2 games. That way, I won't have to keep any physical DVDs around the house, I won't have to switch discs for different games, and because this drive is significantly faster, well, games will load quicker too. But you can't just plug it right into the PS2 because this thing was made 20 years ago. You might not remember this, but the PlayStation 2 could play a limited number of titles online. And in order to do that, you needed a network adapter. And because some of those titles needed patches and upgrades over time, the network adapters came with a little port for installing a small hard drive. So this is actually a modified reproduction network adapter. The original ones had an IDE interface for the hard drives, but this one has been updated to have a more modern SATA interface. So this just plugs right in here, and then this plugs in here. Obviously, Sony saw this coming, so by default, you can't just play games off of the hard drive. You need one other piece of the puzzle. This memory card has been flashed with the free McBoot soft mod. By plugging this into one of the front memory ports, it allows you to boot games off of the hard drive, play region lock content, as well as a whole slew of other functions. It's basically a mod chip where you don't have to do any soldering. Now, even though all of these parts would have fit back inside the original case, I wanted to give the PlayStation 2 a facelift for 2023. So over the course of the next few days, I meticulously measured mounting points, components, and ports to create a 3D model of a brand new case for it. There wasn't much I kept from the original design, but I did want to retain one thing. The PlayStation 2 revolutionized the aesthetics of modern day video game consoles by allowing users to run them either horizontally or vertically, something you can't take for granted even today. At first, everything was going great, but then when it came time to print my first prototype, things took a bit of a turn. Okay, so unfortunately, I've run into a little bit of a roadblock here. The PlayStation 2 is no small console, and in order to create a new shell for it, I've actually exceeded the limits of what my 3D printers can do. The Bamboo Lab X1 carbons have a maximum print volume of 256 by 256 and 256 millimeters, and I need like 270 millimeters. So I could print my shell in multiple pieces and then glue it and assemble it together afterwards, or I could just get a bigger 3D printer. This is the Creality K1 Max, and it can print 300 by 300 by 300 millimeters. And it's also just a great 3D printer in general. I've been using it for the past couple of months now, and I've been thoroughly impressed by how user-friendly it is and also how reliable it is. The only downside to it is that it doesn't have any sort of multi-material system like the AMS, so it's just one filament at a time. But it is saving my ass on this project, so I'll try not to complain about that too much. As fast as the K1 Max is, these were still extremely large prints that were gonna take a while to finish. So while it's printing, let me tell you about an alternative and the sponsor of today's video, PCBWay. They offer a wide variety of prototyping and production services, including, but not limited to, 3D printing, CNCing, and custom PCB fabrication. So if you want to create a project like this one at home, but don't have the same tools that I do, well then you can just send them the design files, they'll handle the fabrication for you and send you back the finished parts. It's a really awesome service and surprisingly affordable. I'm so excited to have them on as a partner that I'm going to be making all the design files for this project available for free down in the video description. That way you can follow along at home regardless of what tools you have. All right, now let's head to the shop and keep going on this project. So while we're here, I would like to focus on doing some cosmetic mods that are gonna beautify this 20-year-old console. But first, we gotta trim a little bit of fat. The mid-frame from the PS2 has a whole bunch of mounting tabs for the original case, so by zipping those off with an angle grinder, I was able to save space and make room for some of the new cable runs. I filed down all the rough edges and then trimmed just a little bit of plastic off of the controller port in order to allow it to sit flush inside of my new case. Then it was time for some styling. I started by prepping for paint. The mid-frame is going to be visible in my new case, so rather than have it be this boring gray, I opted to repaint it in a satin black, which I think looks much better. But if that isn't flashy enough for you, I went a completely different direction for the RF shielding, which is going to end up being a centerpiece of the new case. A few coats of this metallic gold completely transformed its appearance. Now obviously, I couldn't paint the integrated heat sinks as well, but I do think that this combination of gold and silver ended up looking really good. So while we wait for those to dry, the next thing that I want to do is cut some panels that we are then going to inset into the case. And in order to do that, we are going to utilize the CNC, which I have behind me here. The first thing I cut was a side window. The material is cast acrylic, which I've found cuts very nicely on my CNC. This is what's going to allow you to see all of those components we just finished painting. This next piece is a bit of shameless branding. I love reimagining the logos of these old consoles, so I found a recreation of the PS2's font and tried out a few different iterations. Eventually, I landed on the PSZ. After that, I cut a decorative front panel and an exhaust grille that will slot into the top of our new case. With all the pieces cut and sanded, I applied a hard wax finish to seal the wood and also to bring out that beautiful walnut grain. But I wasn't done just yet. Oh man, that looks really cool. But you know what? I think we can actually do better. Because if you remember, the original PS2 logo looked a little something like this. It actually had color to it. So in order to bring that color back into my panel, I mixed up a little bit of everybody's favorite woodworking material, epoxy. But don't worry, I'm just gonna use a bit. To match the colors from the original logo, I opened it up on my phone and then mixed in little key bumps of various mica powders until I got the shades that I was looking for. Maybe a little darker. Then, using a syringe, I mainlined the epoxy right into my engravings. The tricky part here was getting the two colors to blend together seamlessly, but with enough agitation, I eventually got a nice smooth gradient. Finally, I sanded everything down to remove the overfill, reapplied my finish, and then headed home to check on the progress of my 3D prints. So while we were working away in the shop, the 3D printers have also been very busy, and I think we now have everything we need to put this whole system together. So this main piece right here is, well, the main piece, and everything is going to either go inside of it or get grafted onto the outside of it. And it's printed in Creality's Hyper PLA, which is basically just their PLA that's been alloyed with a couple of other plastics that make it stronger, more flexible, and also allow it to print faster. Now, before we can start putting stuff in here, we have to introduce a couple of other little pieces. This is the power switch bracket, and it just gives me a convenient place to mount the original power and reset switch. This clips on here and then screws in here. Next is the fan bracket. This suspends our Noctua fan perfectly in place so that it can cool both the heatsink and the power supply, and it just screws right here on the mid frame. And then finally, we've got this bracket which supports the controller ports. So now let's put it all together. First, the USB-C power port goes here, then the retro gem gets screwed into place right over here, and the Wi-Fi antenna gets mounted to this little platform. Then we can lower the motherboard in and secure it in place. And now we're ready for the network adapter, which I remade in order to make it more compact. It just slides back in here and then gets screwed to the back of the case so that I can easily remove it if I want to add more games in the future. Now let's break out the glue and add all of those little accent pieces. The first one drops in here and dresses up the front face. The PSZ panel goes on the back side of the case. I also added some little feet for when it's standing vertically. The exhaust grill slots in here, and then the acrylic panel slots perfectly into this frame. To attach the side panel to the main case, I added a series of magnets to both sides, and then the whole thing just clicks in place assisted by a couple locator pins. Now, before we get into the testing, I've got one last little cherry that I want to add on top of this project. You guys know me, and I am not a fan of corded controllers. So I went and picked up this wireless adapter from 8BitDo. And the fun thing about this is that it allows you to run first-party Sony controllers with your PS2. And yeah, I know what you're thinking. Sony never made a wireless controller for the PS2, but they did for the PS3, PS4, and PS5. So this allows you to use one of these with the PS2. All right, let's get this thing booted up and see what it can do. So here's the free McBoot interface, and it's basically just a modified version of the normal boot interface with a lot more options added. Here you can load up homebrew software, you can play back media. It also has some diagnostic software built into it and a whole bunch of other fun tools that let you probe a bit deeper into the way that the PS2 works. But I know most of you guys are probably very interested to see what these upscaled games look like and what the retro gem can do. So let's boot up a game. We'll start with Gran Turismo 4 because this is going to show the absolute best of what the system can do. By tapping these buttons right here, you can bring up the retro gem menu. And here we can adjust everything from the resolution, which by the way goes all the way up to 1440p. You can also adjust the aspect ratio as well as the magnification. You can also inject HDR into the image, which to my eye looks really good, at least in the hybrid log gamma mode. It looks pretty trash at HDR10. Now, I bet a bunch of you are probably saying, oh my God, look at all those jaggies on screen. The aliasing is so bad in 4K. And that's why there is a smoothing layer built into the retro gem. So this gives you kind of like a light layer of anti-aliasing across the entire image. So here are what my preferred settings look like, and here's what the original RCA output looks like. As you can see, the difference is kind of insane. Not only do you have a more detailed image, but the colors are also more vibrant. You've got brighter brights, deeper blacks, and a whole host of other image improvements. So that is a best case scenario because Gran Turismo 4 supports a 480p progressive output mode. However, most PlayStation 2 titles are limited to a 480i resolution. I won't go into too much depth here, but basically the way old TVs worked is they would only render every other line of pixels for each frame, and then they would alternate those lines between frames. This is called interlacing. However, modern displays like this one here don't do this. They just display all of the lines all of the time. And that can make the video output from the PS2 look kind of weird. So I've got Final Fantasy X loaded up here, and at first it looks pretty normal. That's because the retro gem has that built-in deinterlacer. If we go through the menus here, we can actually change the algorithm that it's using to various results. So while the image is still, it looks really good. But once you start to move around a bit, well, then things start to fall apart. You get these interlacing artifacts. At first, I was pretty bummed about this, but as it turns out, we can actually fix that. If we go back to the main menu, there's this program here called GSM. And here we can actually force the PlayStation 2 to output a 480p image regardless of whether or not the game was coded to support it. And now if we go back into Final Fantasy X, everything looks so much nicer. This doesn't work with every game, but it does work with the vast majority of titles. So that is my modernized PlayStation 2. And while I love how this thing turned out, I still think that I could have done it better. So let's talk post-mortem analysis. First up, I missed a good opportunity to replace all the capacitors on the main board. Those have a tendency to die in the 20 to 40 year range, so it's good preventative maintenance to do if you've already got the machine all disassembled. Second, running this 5-volt fan at 7 volts kind of ruins the whole point of using a Noctua fan. The higher voltage is causing it to overspin and run a lot louder than it normally would. So what I'm going to do is replace this with a 12-volt fan that will then run slower and quieter. And then finally, I kind of wish I resin 3D printed this whole case. It would have made the final result just look so much more professional. Unfortunately for me though, there is no way this thing would have fit on my resin 3D printer. So if any of you guys in the comments happen to know of a good jumbo size resin 3D printer, I am all ears. And on that note, I'm done. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace. Oh, wait, hold that thought. I have one last thing I want to show you guys. I salvaged the rotating PlayStation logo from the original PS2. So no matter which orientation I have the system in, I can put the PlayStation logo facing the right way. All right, see you for real.